let's talk about Stan Lee.
Hmm.
Stan Lee's role in X-Men. What was his role in the actual series when you guys started to put it together?
Well, it kind of bounced back and forth a little bit. Stan, you know, to give the history, obviously Stan was involved with Marvel since the 1940s, since he was a teenager. Um, and so he is, everybody on the planet knows if you say cartoon writer, first thing you think of Stan Lee.
Mm-hmm.
And he was heavily involved when all their big comic books came out in the 60s. And he and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, all these people created this incredible wealth of stuff that's going to last us another 100 years. And so that was incredible. But by the mid 70s, Stan had kind of stepped back, and he still signed stuff, but he really wasn't involved with the comics much after that. He was kind of their emeritus. He was kind of their father figure that would be, he was incredible at promoting them, and he was an incredible businessman. But the writing of it started to be taken over by other folks. So when we met him in 1992, it had been a while since he'd been directly involved with the books, and he'd been off and on involved in some of the attempts at TV shows in the 80s. And he was a real man. At 70, he had more energy than I did in my 30s. So he was there, and he was gung ho to be part of it, because if you knew Stan, he was an eager, hungry, wanted to be part of everything guy, and he's always there early. He always pissed at people get late for meetings, and he and I would never. I never want to keep people waiting in a meeting, and he was the same way. But so when we got started, Marvel pulled me aside and said, "Look, Stan came up with these characters in the early '60s. The book was okay, but it kind of failed. And then in 1975, it was reborn, and the stuff that we're using now is the new incarnation of the X-Men. The original one was basically all, like white teenage guys
Mm-hmm.
and one girl. It's kind of like the Smurfs, Smurfs and Smurfette, and that had a certain tone to it. And then Stan and Jack handed it off after about a year to some other folks, and it grew. And so he said, "Look, Stan doesn't even kind of know 2/3 of the characters that we're using. We're using later characters,
Mm-hmm.
and we respect him and we love him, but we Marvel now have certain ambitions for the X-Men, and they may be different from Stan's. And Stan's here as out of respect, not out of he's not an actual professional part of producing this show. I mean, he's there, and his name's going to be on it, like it's on all the movies. And the same thing with the movies. They respected him and they loved him, but other people wrote it and other people made the creative decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he was Stan Lee, so he wanted to be part of the show. And he had the ear of Margaret Loesch, who was my boss at Fox. And so he started wanting to make it kind of like what he'd done in the 60s, which was younger and kind of quippier, more wisecracks and less adult.
Mm-hmm.
And so there came a creative meeting where we had to thrash it out with Margaret and her boss, like the head of Fox, and say, "Guys, I've listened to everything Stan's telling me. I want to put everything I can. If he's got suggestions for me, I'm doing it. But we have everybody trying to make this kind of show, and Stan's asking us to make a different kind of show." And that we worked that through, and Stan and I remain good friends. It's one of those creative moments where you have struggle. We worked on 3 or 4 other shows since then together.
Mm-hmm.
When he had a website, he hired me to develop some shows for him on the website, Stanley Media. But there was a moment there where we had to go one way or the other, and I got one of the 2 artists, Will Mineo, who had known Stan since Will was a teenager, and said, "Look, I'll sit in the middle, and I'll take some of Stan's notes. I'll talk to Eric about him. He'll let me know what we can use of his in this first season." And so there was kind of diplomacy there that we did
Mm-hmm.
for about a month or two, and that seemed to make Stan happy and feel like, okay, I've made my contribution to the show. I've given notes on the first 7 or 8 episodes. It's cool. And then when it was successful, we didn't really, once the show came out, because it takes a long time. We had to write all 13 of the first season before one was ever finished in production.
Wow.
And so when they finally came out after the first 13 had been written, and it was such a success, then I think Stan stepped back and said, well, look, these guys know what they're doing. They're taking a direction different from what I would have done, but more power to them. And that was his final contribution. So he worked with us in the first season, in effect. And it was a challenge. I mean, you're sitting there in a room with Stan Lee,
Mm-hmm.
and you're disagreeing with him on some point about a character.
You got to tell him you got to fall back.
Yeah, you got to be honest, or you're not doing your job. It's believe me, that was a challenging part of that whole experience was having maybe to disagree with or occasionally say no to Stan.
Wow, what a story! What
That's
a
amazing.
story!
And I totally can see where he would want to be so hands-on, especially because in all the Marvel movies, he always makes an appearance, like a nice little cameo.
Yep. He sure does. Stan always shows up.
And I usually, every time I watch the movies, like as they were coming out, I'm like, okay, so where is he? I know he's coming. Like with Green Lantern, what was he talking to the elders of Oa? And like I was just like, oh, there he is.
Yeah, he showed up at Black Panther at the casino table.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely.